In this video, I'm going to talk about this set of RB turbos that I did a rebuild for. I didn't do an upgrade for these, it's just a basic rebuild. This is one of the smaller versions, so this one is the 15T that has the TDO4L turbine wheel in it. The TDO4L turbine measures 41 millimeter, and I think it's by 47. The compressor wheel is somewhere around 42 millimeter. I think it's 41.95, and that's by 56 millimeter. Now I'm just going to show you an up-close detailed look at what all has been done to make this work on this turbocharger. To make this work, I think he originally started with a Subaru bearing housing. Then where there was freeze plugs here, those had to be drilled out in size to fit the BMW's factory coolant lines, which use O-rings to seal, and then there's that stud there so that the coolant lines can connect. This turbine housing had to be milled down, and a flange had been pressed inside the turbine housing, then it has to be welded on. They did a really good job with this. There's no cracks in the welds even after this vehicle had been running them on, or been on the vehicle for quite some time. Usually that's an issue. Usually they start to crack at the welds, but that didn't happen. The way to make that work and to make that last is if you heat up the turbine housing and then weld it with a nickel rod. It helps to keep it from cracking. The compressor wheels, that side of the machining is easy. It's just a simple CNC machine program to fit the 15T compressor wheels. This is the part I was talking about, that the compressor wheel is around 42 millimeter on the inducer, so this size. Here's where the V-band connects. The only thing I don't like about these is it shouldn't be touching there if it was a factory TDO4, but it doesn't look like that was an issue with the turbo, so I would say that would pass. They use this rod here, or the connecting arm that has, it's like custom milled, probably a piece of stainless steel. And then the thing I did like about the Wastegate bushing is they used one that was longer, but it started to wear out and was getting sloppy, so I went ahead and put one of our kits in this and repaired it. Here's the machining for the turbine wheel. They did a pretty good job with the machining. For the oil feed, they had to weld a nut on the bearing housing so that the bolt could, and they also milled this area right here. They milled that so the factory oil feed line would fit in there with the O-ring, and they had to mill it flat at the top and at the sides, and just everything they had to do to make that fit in there so that the factory feed line could bolt in. The negative effect of this one is that because it's a TDO4 bearing housing, it's much harder to put that snap ring in that holds the compressor housing on. The work that I did, we did the rebuild. I welded on the new tab, replaced the wastegate arm bushing, or the wastegate arm and bushing. This I kept original, and that tab I kept original from the one that was already on there because I don't have a replacement one that size yet. This is the rear one. This defines it as a 3 series because of it coming out at the bottom and the wastegate at top. If it was the wastegate on the side and then the outlet at the top, then that would be a 5 series or a 1 series, or a right hand drive 3 series from overseas would have the same as a 5 series rear turbo. In the description box, I'll link to the rebuild kit that I used. This kit I put together just for the RB turbo, so don't buy a normal TDO4 kit. Otherwise, If you do, you won't get the right compressor housing O-ring. This kit, it has an upgraded collar, so if you do want to buy one with the stock collar for fitment purposes, make sure you leave me a note upon checkout that you want the factory collar. So I'll show or pop up a picture here so you can see why you need the factory collar if you don't want to cut the bearing housing or machine it. I cut the bearing housing so I can use the wider collar because it's an upgrade and it'll prevent you from having thrust bearing failures. And mainly, you don't need the upgraded collar unless you're planning on running more than around 25 pounds of boost, in which sometimes the thrust bearing just won't hold up because it needs more ground on that bearing from the collar to the bearing, so it has more ground surface on it. And you also need that dual oil port thrust bearing. If you need replacement parts for your RB turbos, this is a TD04L 9-blade. So this isn't going to work on all RB turbos, but this one will work on the 15T version with the TD04L turbine. This turbine is a direct fit for the 12-blade and the 11-blade that they use. So I'll link to that below in the description box. That turbine is also used in Vargas's Stage 2 turbos. And I'll also leave a link to our rebuild kit. This I put together specifically for the RB turbo because it uses a TD03 compressor housing O-ring, and then the rest of the parts are TD04. For this kit, it has an upgraded collar and spacer, so if you do want to use the original or the upgraded collar, then the bearing housing will have to be machined, or you can cut it with a Dremel to make that fit. But if you want to just go with the stock collar and not the upgrade, then please mention upon checkout, leave a note letting us know that you are not planning on cutting the bearing housing and that you want the factory collar. Then for the thrust bearing, this thrust bearing is an upgraded bearing, so it has 2 oil ports in it, and it's drilled through the top and then plugged so that it has the maximum size oil holes in it, and then the front of it is cut with an end mill. The machine bearings are much higher quality because they're machined from a solid piece of copper. A lot of the other companies that have kits for sale, some of them they'd use a powder bearing, and then as a result of that it's like a cast piece. As a result of that, those sometimes have issues cracking and getting hot because the oil hole is not big enough to flow the amount of oil that's necessary to cool down this thrust bearing. The OEM bearing, it's good up to about 25 psi or so, give or take. I know you can do 22 out of it pretty easily without having issues, but once you start to really push the turbos harder and at higher boost levels, you're going to have issues with that thrust bearing, and that's why we have the upgraded kit to prevent that. With the upgraded kit, I've never had anybody have an issue where it failed, where it seemed abnormal. Now, you could still have a thrust bearing failure if you had something clog up the oil feed. I had a guy that put RTV silicone all over his oil feed fitting instead of replacing the O-ring, and that got in the thrust bearing and plugged it off, and then no oil was getting to the thrust bearing and it caused a failure that way. And if you want to buy other parts from a trusted supplier, us, that being me, I guess you could say, I do have the Wastegate repair kits. I'm just going to quickly show you what a poor quality Wastegate repair kit looks like so you can try and avoid this. I don't know where this came from. This is just somebody that bought this kit and then wanted me to repair his turbine housings, and I told him I didn't want to use it, and I'm going to show you why that is. The main thing that I was concerned about, well, I guess the biggest concern is that this piece is really supposed to be smashed down more, and the reason for that is because this washer here, if this top piece of the valve is not smashed down all the way, then this washer can come off and then the valve can separate from the arm. The other thing that is concerning to me is is the diameter of the bushing itself. The diameter of the bushing and the diameter of the arm. The diameter is much smaller on these two pieces. The good thing is that they do go together, but because they are much smaller, it's more likely to wear out a lot quicker. I'm going to show you a comparison a comparison of the OEM size bearing. This is an OEM size bearing, iron bushing, and then this is the wastegate arm that this person is selling people. So it's much more smaller in diameter, and here's the one that we use. So this is designed to be the same diameter as the OEM materials. See, with ours, it has a much thicker washer there, and then the top is pressed down properly so that it can't separate. Here's a quick comparison shot of the two in diameter. And the two bushings. Summary for the RB turbos, the things that I do like about them is that they use the OEM turbine housings. Now, why I like that is because the turbine housings are going to last a whole lot longer than any other turbine housing that you would put on that vehicle. So there are some companies that sell the aftermarket turbine housings with the wastegates, new wastegate arms and all that stuff in there. But the problem with that is they're just cast iron. The cast iron ones are going to crack much sooner, much quicker than the OEM turbine housings. In fact, to this day, the amount of turbine housings that I've seen is cracked is almost zero. It probably is zero because of it being a nickel turbine housing. It has that nickel additive in it, and that helps battle the heat much better. So it stays cooler and it is less resistant to crack. Usually when you have to weld up a turbine housing that's cast iron that has cracked, you have to weld it up with a nickel rod. Otherwise they have issues cracking even further when you're trying to weld it. So why not just use the original nickel housings to begin with to prevent any of these problems happening. That way you have all the headaches removed from your life from having an issue with your turbine housing cracking and pieces of the turbine housing falling in the turbo and destroying it.